This is the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusive ScottishVisits.co.uk.
Hello, this is John Harbour, and welcome to Unique Scotland, the podcast from my website, exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I'm recording this in a wet and windy Highlandsd today, and only 1 week before Christmas. We've had a bit of snow, but nothing to write home about, and, as is often the case on the west coast of Scotland, the snow does not lie long due to the effect of the Gulf Stream that winds its way up the west coast. My last podcast was my monthly letter from Scotland, and before that I gave you a tour from Inverness to the Dornoch, and thank you for all your lovely comments. Well, today, and by popular demand, I will be starting a series of the North Coast 500, a route that will take us along a 516-mile or 830-kilometre scenic route and around the north of Scotland, starting and ending at Inverness Castle. The route, which is known as the NC500, was established in 2015, so only 5 years ago, and links many of the wonderful features of the Northern Highlands of Scotland in one touring route. I'm particularly excited in producing this podcast as I'll be returning to my family roots, that's Mackay country, and I'm delighted to be doing this for a number of fellow Mackays who have asked specifically for a podcast on this area. Now, the route I'm going to take is anti-clockwise, starting at Inverness Castle, and head north past the Black Isle, on up to the Muir of Ord, Dingwall, Dunrobin Castle, stronghold of the Sutherland clan, John O Groats, Thurso, the Castle of May, and that was the late Queen Mother's castle, and as it happens I visited last week, and you can see the photos on my Facebook page. But from there along to Dornoch with its fabulous beaches. Then we'll go to Skourie, where I'll talk about the famous General Mackay, on to Ullapool, then the Dornoch, which many of you will have already heard about in my last podcast, and I told you we'd visit again on my NC500 tour. Then it's Applecross, including the Balak Naba, an incredible winding road down the mountainside, then back through Muir of Ord to Inverness. It's going to be a super trip, and as you will appreciate, it's a long way, thus a multi-part series. I'm not quite sure how many parts there's going to be actually, because it depends upon how often I get waylaid along the route. Anyway, let's see how we get on. Well, I do hope that you enjoy these virtual journeys as I love to share Scotland with you, and hopefully this will whet your appetite to come and visit this fine country. Indeed, I can thank Nathan Shulkovitz for his email. I've obviously whetted his appetite, and fingers crossed for a reopening of the airways next year, I'll see Nathan with family and friends for a wee personal tour. To see some great photographs and videos, you can also visit my website www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk, and you'll get an indication of some of the tours that I do. Now, these are purely examples, so your own tour will be bespoke. It's arranged specifically by me and to your specification. Of course, whilst visiting personally is not yet possible, I'm delighted during this difficult time of COVID to bring you a taste of Scotland and allow you to visit this lovely country from the comfort of your armchair. And actually, I'm going to be giving live interactive video Zoom tours, so watch out for that on my website, and more of that later. And in this podcast, you will hear about Indian-looking temples, Royal Naval mutinies, distilleries, royal castles, crashing waves on amazing sea cliffs and sandy beaches, and much more. So, I'd now like you to relax wherever you are and thoroughly enjoy the first part of our Unique Scotland journey around the North Coast 500. This episode will cover the route from Inverness towards John O Groats. So take time out for the next 30 or 40 minutes or so to travel with me on this extraordinary journey to the wild and rugged north coast of Scotland. It's going to be great fun. I'm often asked if I don't get bored with travelling all over Scotland and seeing some of the same places that I've visited before. My answer is a resounding no. Mainly because it's always changing, whether that's the weather, the light, the people you meet who enrich the experience, or simply discovering something you didn't see first time around. And the feeling of excitement never goes away, to which I can testify in that only last week I took time out to do a recce of the far north before starting this podcast. I rented a small cottage in Brora, just north of Inverness, on the east coast. Fabulous, by the way, and it was overlooking Brora Links golf course with the sea just beyond. And it was only a short walk of 5 minutes to get to the glorious beach that stretched for miles. I used Brora as a stepping stone to the north, and on day 2 I drove up to Caithness and visited the Castle of May and Dunnet Head, which is the most northerly point on the mainland of Great Britain. I had the headland to myself, and I could see the sun shining on the cliffs of the Orkney Islands in the distance, and my egg and mayo sandwich with coffee tasted even better in the biting wind that blew across the Pentland Firth from the north. I'd been there a few times before, but it was still absolutely breathtaking. So on to our tour of the NC500, and we commence our trip from Inverness. Now, the last 3 touring podcasts were on Inverness to Dornoch and back, and if you haven't listened to them, then please do, as they complement this series. I did give a 2-day tour of Inverness in that series, so we'll not go into too much detail here. Before we get into the car to head north from Inverness across the Kessock Bridge, it's worth noting that NC500 project was only launched in 2015 by a tourism project board in an attempt to fill a gap in the Northern Highlands tourism sector, and it's quite clear that it has been a resounding success, with many more visitors taking time out to travel so far north. Indeed, I've heard it being called Scotland's Route 66. Well, I can't say for sure as I've never travelled the Route 66, but that is on my bucket list. In fact, I can imagine myself travelling in a large Cadillac, open-topped of course. Our route will traverse the traditional boundaries or counties of Inverness, Ross and Cromarty, Sutherland and Caithness. Sutherland is the name of the clan who took possession of the Mackay lands in the 17th and 19th centuries, and I'm not bitter, but I will talk about that a little more as we work our way around the coast. So today we are all in Inverness, and last week you had a walking tour of the town, and I told you about some of the more prominent features and buildings, including the old toll booth and the townhouse, and I tried to give you a feel of what Inverness would have looked like in the 16th century. The official start point of the NC500 is the castle, and that sits up on a steep bank overlooking the River Ness. It's a 19th century red sandstone building which replaces the old ruined castle. That was blown up by Bonnie Prince Charlie in 1746, and I've talked about that in previous podcasts. Well, we drive out of the city to pick up the road to the north, and we soon come to the Kessock Bridge, which will take us on to the Black Isle and beyond. We'll be crossing the Bewley Firth on the left-hand side and the Moray Firth on the right. Now, I've explained it before, but a firth does come from the word fjord, which you may have heard of associated with Norway. Well, it's the same here, a long river leading out to the sea, and in this case the North Sea, created by activity of glaciation and erosion millions of years before. The Moray Firth runs along the coast of the county of Moray, while the Bewley Firth takes its name from a small town called Bewley on the upper reaches of the wide river, and Bewley comes from the French beau lieu, which means beautiful place. The Kessock Bridge is an amazing feat of engineering. It opened in 1982, it's 3,500 feet long, or just over 1,000 metres. The river below is a navigable waterway, so the bridge is raised to a high level and the 4 towers dominate the Inverness skyline, especially at night when they're lit up. It replaced a ferry, or if people didn't want to take the ferry, it was a 45-minute drive around the coast via Bewley to get to the north. And if you've listened to my previous podcast, you will have heard me talking about the Great Glen geological fault, and that's the geological fault line that runs northeast-southwest through the Great Glen. As it happens, Inverness is at the head of the Great Glen, and the bridge straddles that fault line. So to protect against any potential seismic activity, the bridge construction included seismic buffers at the base of the North Tower, which I find just staggering. Anyway, crossing the bridge is a joy in itself, with the views down across Inverness and the exit of the Caledonia Canal to the left, and on the right you can see well down the Moray Firth towards the North Sea itself. On a clear day you might even be able to see Fort George, an amazing structure that juts right out into the Moray Firth, which was built as a barracks for around 1,000 soldiers, built in the late 1700s after the final Jacobite battle and defeat at Culloden. Well, we're soon on to the Black Isle, and I'm often asked where the name comes from. Well, firstly, it's not an island, but a peninsula surrounded on 3 sides by the sea. And to be honest, no one really knows where the name comes from, but there are a number of stories, and the one I like best is that in the winter, where everywhere around the Black Isle is white with snow, the influence of the warmer sea around the peninsula means that snow does not lie very long and the ground looks black compared to the white snow-laden areas around. Well, we're going to continue along the main road past the Black Isle, which will be a separate podcast, but you've got much to look forward to, including the Clwthy Well at Munlochy, Rosemarkie with a fabulous golf course, and Fortrose, where a point of land juts out onto the Moray Firth, from where on most days you can catch a glimpse of dolphins playing in the churning water of the turning tidal stream. Much more to come. After a few miles we reach a turning point on the road, the A835. Now, in the last podcast, when we were on our way to Gairloch, we turned left here, heading west to the Gairloch, but this time we'll continue on and cross the Cromarty Firth onto Invergordon, Tain, and for whisky lovers, the Glenmorangie distillery, before heading further north. So, after this junction, and 5 miles further on, a body of water comes into view. It's the Cromarty Firth, named after the town at the mouth of the river called Cromarty, and stretches inland some 16 miles to the town of Dingwall, connecting with the River Conan. Now, many may remember from the BBC World Shipping Forecast that Cromarty was one of the weather regions mentioned there. Well, the road descends quite steeply, and the causeway-looking bridge crossing of the Firth comes into view. It's about 1 mile in length. It's flat-topped, with a 2-lane road and a walkway either side of the road. The deck sits on 67 piers, and its design ensures that tidal flows in the Firth remain unchanged, protecting feeding grounds for migratory seabirds. It was opened in 1979 and took 2 years to build. It's a very pleasant crossing with good views down the river to Dingwall, some 3 miles away, and upriver towards Invergordon. And there's always something to see on the crossing, whether it's a seal or one of the many seabirds that make the Cromarty Firth their breeding and feeding grounds. Once across the river, we turn right, and the road runs parallel to the Firth all the way up to its exit at Cromarty, and more of that shortly. Across the Firth, the north shore of the Black Isle is visible. After a mile on the right-hand side, we see the storehouse of Fowis, which is a renovated 18th century gurnal or rent house, and is one of the finest remaining examples of what used to be a familiar type of building dotted along the coasts of Easter Ross and Sutherland. It's a tall 4-storey building, rather plain, with a slate roof and harling or stucco on the outside, painted in a sandy colour, true to the original design. Well, after the 1707 union of Scotland and England, links with the south improved dramatically, and this is one of the connections with that past in terms of trading links. These gurnals were built to enable the landowner to store grain before it was loaded onto ships and taken to markets in the south and overseas. Although its renovation has allowed it to retain its original charm, the storehouse now houses an excellent visitor centre with entertaining and informative exhibitions of the history of the area and the wildlife. The Cromarty Firth itself is well known for its colony of common seals, and from the visitor centre these fascinating creatures can be viewed on some of the sites that they haul themselves out onto to rest. The Firth is also internationally known as a wintering and feeding ground for migratory birds, and most winters it's home to 30,000 waterfowl. Indeed, the Cromarty Firth and surrounding area has been designated a Site of Special Scientific Interest, or SSSI for short. I also tell my guests to keep a sharp lookout for dolphins, harbour porpoises, minke whales and basking sharks, who are all seasonal visitors. As we continue northwest along the A9 with Cromarty Firth still on our right-hand side, we get a glimpse of a monument sitting high up on a hill above the town of Inverness that we'll pass on our route north. Indeed, just before we arrive at Inverness, there's a junction onto the B9170, which we won't be taking this time, and that leads up to Struy Hill, where you literally climb up over the mountains and drop down on the other side to get to the Dornoch Firth. It's also known as the $1 Million View. The road over the hill rises to about 700 feet, and the panorama across Sutherland is breathtaking, with a view as far as Benmore Ascent to the west on a clear day. We'll continue on through Inverness and get a good view of the monument. I always stop to have a look at it through binoculars and to see what my guests make of it. There's always some surprise, as the monument is a large Gothic-style archway with pillars on both sides. Some guess at an Indian influence, and they're correct. It's called the Fyrish Monument, was built in 1782 on the orders of Sir Hector Munro, who was the Commander-in-Chief in India from 1764 to 65. It's suggested that he had it built to give locals work during a particularly difficult time of the clearances. The monument actually represents the gate of Negapatam, a port in Madras in India, which General Munro took for the British in 1781. As for Inverness, the new A9 road skirts to the south of the village, so you almost miss it, but it's interesting just to detour onto the old road, if you have time. It's a small village of only 6,000 inhabitants, but continues to grow, so there must be lovely fresh air and Highland life to attract some. It has won the Scotland in Bloom competition in the past, and in 2018 it was crowned the Scottish champion at the Greatest British High Street Awards, impressing with its reinvention over the years to become a place to find everything from florists and bridal wear to delicatessens and bakeries. The other plus point of Inverness is its distillery, the Dalmore. The Dalmore's heritage dates back to 1263. It was in this year that Colin of Kintail, chief of Clan Mackenzie, saved King Alexander III from the fury of a charging stag. In recognition of this noble act, the king granted Mackenzie clan the right to use the 12-pointed royal stag emblem on their coat of arms. When descendants of the clan became owners of the Dalmore distillery in 1867, the royal stag became the recognisable icon that proudly adorns each bottle of the Dalmore today. And I know that whisky lovers out there will look for that on Dalmore whisky labels from now on. The Dalmore distillery was actually founded by Alexander Matheson, and it's been operating on the shores of the Cromarty Firth since 1839. Now, I've personally enjoyed a glass of the Dalmore and found it to be a lovely, rich whisky with chocolatey, orangey and nutty flavours. And these come from the 30-year-old Gonzales Baez sherry casks used by the distillery. I have to say it's a treat to be had, and once more, if time permits, it's always a good place to stop for a wee visit. It's at Dalmore that our route on the A9 splits from the coastal road, which means we'll bypass the next town of Invergordon, but it's one that I particularly want to tell you about, mainly because of my naval background. The site of Invergordon was originally known as Anrud, the point or ness. It was later changed to Inverbrike, the mouth of the River Brike, which was a stream that entered the Cromarty Firth at Roskeen Bridge, near the old parish church. From the 1250s to 1704, Inverbrike was successfully in the hands of the Munro families, the Inneses and the Ross families. However, in 1704 the estate was bought from George Ross of Morangie by Sir William Gordon, who renamed the estate after himself, thus Invergordon. Real growth came to the town in the later 1700s, when a planned town was laid out on a grid pattern by the Gordons. The first real harbour was constructed in 1828, and it's been repeatedly expanded and enhanced since. And because of the deep water within the Firth, it was considered to be an excellent place to construct a sizable port, and in the early 20th century a naval base was built to take the Northern Royal Fleet, evidence of which remains in the fuel tank farm lying behind the town centre, and also the disused airfield near Eventon, which was built to take aircraft from the fleet carriers while they were at anchor. The Firth forms one of the safest and most commodious anchorages in the north of Scotland, and Invergordon became a major base for the Royal Navy's home fleet. During World War II, there was a large training and operational base for Catalina amphibious aircraft and Sunderland seaplanes, which extended from Invergordon to Alness Point. Some of the largest battleships congregated here during the First and Second World Wars, and now, where once warships docked, the facilities are used for cruise ships in the summer and oil field and oil rig support vessels throughout the year. But with my Royal Naval connections, I want to tell you about the Invergordon mutiny, which is still remembered in naval wardrooms today. The story goes back to 1931 Britain, which, in common with the other major industrial nations, was in the grip of an economic crisis. The national government, a coalition led by Ramsay MacDonald, had to find ways of cutting expenditure and, among a number of unpopular measures, decided to reduce the pay of all military personnel. The pay of admirals was reduced by 7%, chief petty officers or NCOs by 11%, and able seamen by 23%. Now you can see that the most junior lower deck seamen would not be overly pleased, not just with the extraordinary reduction in pay, but also the disparity between the lowest ranks and the highest. News of the cuts broke on September the 11th, 1931, just as the Atlantic Fleet was gathering at Invergordon for manoeuvres. On Sunday 13 September, unusually large numbers of men went ashore. Discussion among small groups in the town throughout the day culminated in a mass meeting in the shore canteen in the evening. Several men made speeches and rousing songs were sung, and a gentleman called Able Seaman Len Wincott of Hitchmas, Norfolk, called for a strike. "It will be passive resistance and no bloodshed." Well, on Tuesday the 15th, several ships were due to go out on exercises. HMS Repulse sailed as planned, but the other ships were unable to follow as the men refused to carry out the necessary duties. When news of the mutiny spread to London, there was panic in the stock exchange and a run on the pound. Much was done to try to convince the men to get back to work, and there was even a suggestion that troops would be sent to quell the unrest. In the end, the Prime Minister stated that the cuts would not exceed 10%, and the men returned to their duties. Later, despite the Prime Minister's statement that there would be no victimisation following the mutiny, Wincott and other leading participants were discharged from the Royal Navy on November the 3rd, 1931, immediately after the general election. Now, Wincott, who was born in Leicester in 1907 and joined the Royal Navy in 1920, was an extraordinary individual. After his discharge from the Royal Navy, he became a workers' hero in Britain, and it's thought this is when his involvement with the Communist Party started. Now, he was unable to find work, and by the mid-1930s he'd left the country to fight against General Franco in Spain, and by 1938 he was living in Leningrad and later became a Soviet citizen. During World War II he lived throughout the siege of Leningrad and received a medal for his part in the city's defence. However, in 1946 he fell out of favour with the authorities and was sent to a Siberian labour camp for agitation against the Soviet state. 10 years later, the new Soviet leader Khrushchev came to Britain, and during his visit he was petitioned by family and friends seeking Wincott's release. Wincott was set free in 1957, and apart from a few brief visits to Britain, spent the rest of his life in Moscow, where he died in 1983. At his own request, Wincott's ashes were committed to the sea in Plymouth Sound. The arrangements for this were made by friends from the Navy, with whom he'd remained in contact. The Royal Navy provided a ship flying the White Ensign at half-mast, and Wincott's Russian widow was present, and this was a fitting end for a man who'd almost accidentally played an important part in 20th century naval history and been severely punished for it. His widow said at the ceremony, "In the depths of his soul, my husband was an Englishman who remained proud to have served in the Royal Navy." I ponder these events as I drive away from Invergordon, and I remember my own time in the Royal Navy. And to break the reverie, I remember my first time sailing into Invergordon in 1986. I was the navigating officer of an offshore patrol vessel, and I do remember the entrance to the Cromarty Firth, which is guarded by two precipitous 500-feet headlands. These are actually called the suitors, from a resemblance to a couple of shoemakers, and in Scots, a suitor is a cobbler, and they look as if they're bent over their lasts. As you enter, you're passing between Nigg to the north and Cromarty to the south. Nigg was the site of a crude oil storage and processing depot for oil piped in from the now abandoned Beatrice oil field in the Moray Firth, and of a major energy park including a dry dock. It's not uncommon to find many floating oil rigs at the mouth of the Firth still today being supported by Nigg and Invergordon. But the last time I was actually on board a Royal Navy warship in Invergordon was only 3 years ago, in 2017, when I was delighted to be invited on board Britain's latest and most powerful warship, the aircraft carrier HMS Queen Elizabeth. Now, the wonderful thing about the armed forces is that when you make a friend, you make a friend for life. And although I'd not seen him for many years, my good friend on that occasion was Robert, better known as Bob Hawkins. Now, Bob was the executive officer on board HMS Queen Elizabeth, and I spent a splendid evening, including a tour of the ship with my old shipmate. Fabulous. But I must stop there before I get carried away reminiscing. And let's continue with our tour up the northeast coast of Scotland. After leaving Invergordon, about 10 miles later, we arrive at the town of Tain, which is also home to the famous whisky distillery Glenmorangie. The name Tain derives from the nearby river Tain, the name of which comes from an Indo-European root meaning flow. The Gaelic name Val Duthac means Duthacs town, after a local saint. Tain was granted its first royal charter in 1066, making it Scotland's oldest royal borough, and that was commemorated 900 years later, in 1966, with the opening of the Rose Garden by Queen Elizabeth the Queen Mother, and the Rose Garden is something you must stop to see. The town owes much of its importance to Duthac. He was an early Christian figure, perhaps 8th or 9th century, whose shrine had become so important by 1066 that it resulted in the Royal Charter. The ruined chapel near the mouth of the river was said to have been built on the site of his birth. Duthac became an official saint in 1419, and by the late Middle Ages his shrine was an important place of pilgrimage in Scotland. Indeed, King James IV of Scotland came at least once a year throughout his reign to achieve both spiritual and political aims. It's often said that Tain stands between the Heather and the sea, effectively the Heather of the Highlands in the west and the North Sea in the east. As the oldest royal borough in Scotland, it's proud of its possession of over 950 years' history, offering a haven of rest in a world of frenetic activity. Tain gives you a lot to write home about, with its industry in forestry, distilling, cheese making, salmon and mussel fishing, jewellery, and pottery production. The Tain pottery, for example, now firmly established as one of the largest Scottish ceramic manufacturers, offers a range of products created by traditional craft, technique and skill. And as it happens, I actually have some in my house. It's a large fruit bowl with a lovely bluish hue and some thistles hand-painted into the ceramic. Well, you have to come off the main A9 road to drive into the centre of the town, but it's always a pleasure driving among the sturdy yellow sandstone built buildings, and I particularly like the Tain Sheriff Court and Toll Booth. It's a dominant, strong-looking stone tower with conical stone-roofed spire, and it was built around 1706. The tower itself houses a bell dating from 1630. There is much more to explore in the town, so don't bypass it if you're heading north. However, we will have to leave to push on, but I can't leave without mentioning the Glenmorangie distillery nearby. It was always a dream of the Morangie farmer William Matheson and his wife Anne to own a distillery. I mean, isn't that something we all dream about? But in this case, William and Anne made their dream come true, and since 1843 they have been crafting their single malt at the Glenmorangie distillery. It's beautifully positioned outside Tain, just to the north of the town, and sits on the right-hand side of the road as you approach the Dornoch Firth crossing. Its position could not be better, as it overlooks the sands of the Dornoch Firth and the wide river beyond. It's a great visit, and the copper stills in which they distill their spirit are the tallest in Scotland. With necks as tall as a giraffe, they create more space for taste and aroma. It's a very popular whisky, and I know that certainly all my American guests seem to have tasted it. Glenmorangie. Even the name has a romantic ring about it. When we leave the distillery, we head north once more, and come to the Dornoch Firth Bridge, a flat platform bridge just over half a mile long. There are concrete stanchions in the Firth holding up 21 sections of concrete road. Now the bridge, which was opened by the late Queen Mother in August 1991, reduced a much longer route around the Firth via Bonar Bridge of some 26 miles. This Firth forms part of the boundary between Ross and Cromarty to the south, from where we've just come, and Sutherland to the north. The Firth is designated a National Scenic Area, one of 40 such areas in Scotland. Just as we approach the north shore of the Firth, a fabulous stretch of the Dornoch sands open up on our right-hand side, and this stretches all the way around the mouth of the river to the town of Dornoch itself, our next stop in about 5 minutes. Before we get to Dornoch, I just want to mention Skibo Castle, that you will see on your maps. It's on our left-hand side as we come off the bridge, but we won't see it from the roadside due to a covering of trees around the estate. There's been a dwelling on this land since the 13th century, and a mansion house was built in 1770. In 1897, the wealthy industrialist Andrew Carnegie bought the house and spent a fortune on improvements, plus the creation of Loch Ospedale, and also an indoor swimming pool pavilion and a 9-hole golf course. It's known that the great and good of the late 19th century, including royalty, were entertained here. Skibo stayed with the Carnegie family until 1982. It was later purchased by businessman Peter de Savary and used as the foundation of a private members' club, and, as they say, if you have to ask the price for membership, then you probably can't afford it. Most of my guests know Carnegie for his incredible wealth, created as a steel magnate in the USA, but how many of you know that he was just a poor wee boy from Dunfermline, which is just north of Edinburgh, before his family emigrated? And he became the richest man in the world, the Bill Gates of his time, another great Scot. Well, we'll leave the A9 road to get down to the town of Dornoch, which is about a mile away, and it's certainly worth detouring off the main route to see this delightful small town. Just before getting into the town centre, on the left-hand side, you pass an impressive Dornoch War Memorial. This well-known Scottish memorial has the magnificent sculpture of a 5th Seaforth Highlander. It represents a soldier around 1916 at Beaumont Hamel, looking south towards the battlefields. Now, Beaumont Hamel is a commune in the Somme department in Hauts-de-France in North France. During the First World War, Beaumont Hamel was close to the front line, near many attacks, especially during the Battle of the Somme, one of the largest and bloodiest Allied offensive of the First World War. And by 1918, the village had been almost totally destroyed. And that's quite a thought as we enter the beautiful town of Dornoch, and the first thing that stands out dead ahead is a stone-built tower-house castle right in this centre. This is now a hotel, but it is in fact the old Dornoch Castle. It is almost certainly on the site of the original Bishop's Palace of St Gilbert, who founded the Cathedral, which is just opposite the castle, and that was in the 13th century. The present castle dates from about the 15th century, and was given to the Earl of Sutherland by his brother-in-law, Bishop Robert Stewart. The earliest surviving documentary evidence of the castle or Bishop's Palace is the Charter of 1557, by which Bishop Robert appointed the Earl of Sutherland and his heirs to be hereditary constables for Dornoch. And quoting from a document of the time, it says that the palace was situated in the Gaelic-speaking country among the wild, unbridled, untamed and savage Scots. The appointment was made by the bishop, who was alarmed by the progress of the religious reformers, and he wished to safeguard the property of the church by putting it temporarily in the care of his relations. Of course, only 3 years later, in 1560, and led by John Knox, the Reformation occurred, and the cathedral changed from a Catholic place of worship to a Protestant church. And now turning to the cathedral. In the 13th century, Gilbert de Moravia, a relation of the Earls of Murray and the first Earl of Sutherland, was elected to Bishopric of Caithness. The seat of the Diocese of Caithness was originally at Halkirk, that's 65 miles to the north. But owing to the brutal murder of the two bishops who preceded Gilbert, his first decision was to transfer the seat of the diocese to Dornoch. Here, Gilbert built this wonderful cathedral. Now, it's uncertain how long it took to fully complete it, but in 1239 the building was far enough along for the first service to be held. From the time of its completion until the Reformation some 340 years later, Gilbert's Cathedral stood in its original state. In 1570 it was set on fire, and Gilbert's tomb was desecrated during a clan feud between the Murrays of Dornoch and the Mackays of Strathnaver. Now I have to register an interest here because my ancestors were Mackays from Strathnaver. Almost totally destroyed except for the chancel and transept walls, the cathedral was partially restored in 1616 by Sir Robert Gordon, and then between 1835 and 1837 a further restoration was completed by the Duchess Countess of Sutherland, and the Sutherland burial vault is actually under the floor of the chancel, and that's now sealed off. The cathedral has many other interesting features. On the outside of the cathedral, gargoyles have been set in the eaves. At one time they were thought to be evil spirits which the ringing of the tower bells had driven from the cathedral and turned to stone. Of interest inside the cathedral is the piscina, a small basin from which a pipe leads to the cemetery outside. Any wine remaining after the Catholic Mass would have been poured into the piscina. Now I keep calling it a cathedral, but after the Reformation, Dornoch was no longer a Roman Catholic church. However, the name cathedral, which basically means seat of a bishop, has been retained as a reminder of the church's history. Also of interest, especially to Americans, are the stained glass windows on the north side of the chancel, and these windows were donated in memory of Andrew Carnegie, who often summered at his Skibo castle that I've just mentioned. The three windows represent music, peace and literacy, three of Carnegie's main concerns. On the 22nd of December 2000, the 17th century cathedral played host to a special baptism, that of Madonna and Guy Ritchie's son. They had previously been married by the Reverend Susan Brown of the cathedral in nearby Skibo Castle, and guests were invited to their son's baptism at this famous place. Dornoch is just such a delightful wee town, with the centre dominated by the castle and the cathedral, and just outside the cathedral is a beautifully painted fountain erected by Miss Georgina Anderson in the late 19th century, and there's a village green adorned with flowers in the summer. There's also a historical centre, and a short drive to the east of the village brings you to Royal Dornoch Golf Course. Now, golf's been played on Dornoch links since the 16th century, although formal permission to play was only granted to the Sutherland Golfing Society in 1877. In 1906, the Duchess of Sutherland asked King Edward VII to grant the title Royal to the Dornoch Golf Club, a move which led to a marked expansion in membership. The course has been named number 1 in the world by Golfscape, and famous members include legends of the game Greg Norman, Ernie Els and Tom Watson. And then, just on the other side of the golf course is Dornoch Sands, which leads out into the North Sea. Golden and stretching for miles, you can see how easy it is to be waylaid in such a lovely place, especially when I've got my golf clubs with me. Just before we finish for the day, it's a short walk along the golf course road to a private house with a small stone monument in the garden, and that small stone commemorates the last woman, Janet Horne, to be accused of witchcraft in Scotland in 1727, and she was burnt alive at the stake. But that story having been told, it shouldn't detract from Dornoch's beauty. And another short walk, literally a couple of minutes, around the corner, and we're back where we started, the Dornoch Castle Hotel, and that's our resting place for the night. Well, as we book in and settle down for an evening in the Dornoch Castle Hotel, we can reflect upon the day's activities and how much we've packed in. A relaxing evening in sumptuous surroundings with excellent food and wine beckon. Maybe a quick shower before dinner. Tomorrow we'll continue north into Caithness, passing through Golspie, Barora, Helmsdale, before we get to John O Groats, which lies on Great Britain's northeastern tip. Now, John O Groats is popular with tourists as one end of the longest distance between two inhabited points on the British mainland, with Land's End in Cornwall lying 876 miles southwest. We'll also visit the Castle of May, which is the late Queen Mother's home, and then pass through Thurso before going on to the Mackay Museum at Betty Hill, and then we'll go to see the ruined Mackay Castle at Tung. I will be right at home. The north coast is beautifully rugged, with fabulous sandy beaches and spectacular views to the far north, with the Orkney Islands often visible on a clear day. It's going to be great. Well, thank you once more to the comments from listeners and for your supportive emails. I know that there are a few of my previous guests who will recognise some of the sites that I talk about on our Mackay Clan tours, so welcome and enjoy another look at Mackay country. Some of my listeners have been asking if I was going to start live interactive Zoom Eventbrite virtual tours. Well, you'll be delighted to hear the first one will be held in January, and it's going to be a tour of the Trossachs. It's a beautiful mountainous, forested, loch-filled part of Scotland between Stirling and Loch Lomond, so be prepared to sign up through my website. It should go live next week. I'm also going to try to do an event on a Saturday night at about 9 p.m. Eastern Pacific time, and that's to help my American listeners. So watch this space. Of course, the best way to get notification of future events is to email subscribe. So do that from the website and you will get automatic notification of future events. I now appear on a few channels and you'll be listening to me either directly from the website or one of the Spotify, Google, Apple, etc. under the name of Unique Scotland. You can also find me on Twitter at ESV John. That's Echo Sierra Victor John, which stands for effectively Exclusive Scottish Visits John. But look me up and follow and mention our connection. Well, I do hope that you have enjoyed this week's podcast as much as I've enjoyed bringing it to you. Any comments are always most welcome, and drop me a line using the contact page on my website www.exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. I always love to hear how and where you're listening to the podcasts. I wish you continuing health and happiness, and during these very strange times, do keep up the morale and stay safe. And don't forget, if you have great personal challenges at the moment, remember that saying, you can't cross the sea merely by standing staring at the water. I send my very best wishes to you wherever you are in the world, and I raise a glass in the traditional Scottish fashion, Slàinte.
You've been listening to the Unique Scotland podcast with exclusivescottishvisits.co.uk. To receive all our episodes automatically, please subscribe now.